hidden in the heart of Santa Rosa, California, where Victorian dreams meet California gold and the ghosts of earthquake fires still whisper through reconstructed streets, stands a mansion that survived what destroyed a city. Not through luck, not through chance, but through something more deliberate. The vision of a man who understood that in California, permanence was the ultimate luxury. That in a land of boom and bust, of gold rushes and earthquakes, of fortunes made overnight and lost by morning, the greatest statement of wealth wasn't ostentation. It was survival. This is McDonald Mansion, and its story isn't just about architecture or affluence. It's about California itself, about the transformation from frontier to civilization, from gold camps to grand estates, from transient wealth to established legacy. About what it meant to build something, meant to last in a place where nothing seemed permanent. About one family's determination to prove that California fortunes could be as solid as Eastern ones, that Western wealth could create Eastern elegance, that the frontier could produce refinement without losing its essential character. The year is 1877. California is only 27 years removed from the gold rush. San Francisco has burned and rebuilt multiple times. The West is still being won, still being defined, still figuring out what it will become. And in Santa Rosa, a growing town in Sonoma County, surrounded by fertile valleys and ambitious dreams, a man named Roderick McDonald makes a decision. He will build a mansion, not a mining camp cabin upgraded, not a rough-hewn ranch house expanded, but a proper Victorian mansion that could stand in Boston or Philadelphia without apology. A statement that California has arrived, that Western wealth deserves Eastern respect, that the frontier era is ending and something more permanent, more civilized, more enduring is taking its place. But here's what makes this story fascinating from the very beginning. Roderick McDonald wasn't building for himself alone. He was building for California's future, for the idea that this young state could create architecture and culture that would outlast the gold that funded it, that would survive the earthquakes that routinely shattered cities, that would prove California wasn't just a place people came to get rich and leave. It was a place worth staying, worth building, worth leaving a legacy. The architect he chose, or perhaps who chose itself through the pattern books of the era, was George Franklin Barber's design. Barber was a Tennessee architect who never saw most of the buildings bearing his name. He created pattern books, mail-order architecture, essentially. You'd select a design from his catalog, purchase the plans, and local builders would construct your dream house from those blueprints. This was revolutionary democratization of architectural sophistication. You didn't need to hire an expensive architect. You didn't need to travel east to study the latest styles. You just needed Barber's catalog, enough money to build, and the vision to see your future rising from California earth. But why McDonald Mansion? Why this specific design in this specific location? Santa Rosa wasn't San Francisco. It wasn't a major city. It was a county seat, yes, but still relatively modest. So why build here? Why make this statement in what was essentially still a frontier town? Because that's exactly the point. McDonald wasn't following fashion. He was creating it. He wasn't building where everyone expected mansions. He was building where he believed mansions would someday be expected. He was betting on Santa Rosa's future, on Sonoma County's fertility, on California's inevitable transformation from wilderness to civilization. The location had strategic significance beyond mere aesthetics. Santa Rosa sat in the heart of wine country before anyone called it that, surrounded by valleys perfect for agriculture, connected by railroad to San Francisco, far enough from the city to be pastoral, close enough to be accessible. This was land with future value, not just current usefulness. But there's another layer to this mystery. The mansion was built in 1877, just 11 years before the massive 1888 earthquake that would damage much of Santa Rosa, 29 years before the catastrophic 1906 earthquake that would devastate San Francisco and severely damage Santa Rosa. Was this just coincidence, or did McDonald, perhaps unconsciously, build with California's geological violence in mind? The mansion's survival through multiple major earthquakes suggests either remarkable construction or remarkable luck, possibly both. The real purpose behind this grand structure wasn't immediately obvious. Yes, it was a family home, but it was also a declaration, a statement that read, California wealth is real wealth. Western fortunes can build Eastern elegance. This frontier will become a civilization, and we are the ones civilizing it. The mansion was both home and manifesto, residence and revolution. Why build here in this spot? Because empty land becomes valuable land when someone with vision builds something worth preserving. Because Santa Rosa in 1877 was possibility waiting for form. Because McDonald understood that the greatest fortunes aren't made by following established patterns. They're made by creating new ones that others will follow. Roderick McDonald came from Scottish immigrant stock, people who understood both hardship and ambition, who knew that success in America required vision beyond the immediate, planning beyond the present. His fortune came from California's agricultural abundance, not gold mining that was already becoming yesterday's opportunity, but the land itself, the valleys, the crops, the reliable, renewable wealth that came from understanding what California's climate and soil could produce. This was the new California money, not luck, but systematic development of resources that would generate income for generations. Orchards, vineyards, grain fields. McDonald wasn't betting on finding gold. He was cultivating it from the earth, harvest by harvest, season by season. The decision to build the mansion came from success, yes, but also from something deeper, a desire to establish roots in a place notorious for transience. California in 1877 was still largely populated by people passing through. Get rich and go back east, that was the pattern. McDonald was rejecting that pattern. He was saying, this is home. This is permanent. This is where my family's future will unfold. The construction timeline was remarkable for its ambition. Victorian mansions of this scale and sophistication typically took 2 to 3 years to complete if everything went smoothly, which it rarely did. Materials had to be sourced. Skilled craftsmen had to be found or imported. Designs had to be adapted to California conditions while maintaining Eastern aesthetic standards. George Franklin Barber's plans provided the blueprint, but local builders had to interpret and execute those plans using California materials and California labor. This created a fascinating hybrid. Eastern design sensibility filtered through Western building practices, Victorian elegance constructed with frontier resourcefulness. The materials told their own story. Redwood, California's signature building material, provided structural strength and natural earthquake resistance that Eastern hardwoods couldn't match. The wood came from giants that had stood for centuries, now repurposed into human shelter that would hopefully stand for centuries more. But McDonald didn't rely solely on local materials. Windows were imported likely from San Francisco or even further east. Hardware, doorknobs, hinges, locks came from Eastern manufacturers who specialized in Victorian decorative metalwork. Wallpapers were ordered from pattern books. Light fixtures were purchased from catalogs. The mansion was assembled from components sourced across the continent, a physical manifestation of California's growing integration into national commercial networks. The challenges the builders faced were uniquely Californian. Unlike Eastern construction where foundations could be dug deep into stable soil, California builders had to account for earthquake potential. The mansion's foundation required extra attention, not just supporting the structure above, but allowing it to flex and move during seismic events without catastrophic failure. Water was another challenge. Santa Rosa wasn't as dry as Southern California, but reliable water sources still required planning. Wells had to be dug. Cisterns had to be installed. The mansion needed to be as self-sufficient as possible because urban utilities were still decades away in this part of California. The estate occupied several acres, not vast by ranch standards, but substantial for an in-town mansion. This was enough land for extensive gardens, outbuildings, and the psychological buffer that wealthy Victorians expected. Enough space to feel separate from neighbors while remaining part of the town's social fabric. The lot's location within Santa Rosa was carefully chosen, prominent enough to be noticed, elevated enough to have views, accessible enough for visitors. McDonald wasn't hiding his success. He was displaying it, but with Victorian restraint rather than frontier boastfulness. The mansion announced prosperity without shouting about it. The significance of building here, in Santa Rosa rather than San Francisco, was multifaceted. Partly practical, land was cheaper, building was easier, life was calmer, but partly philosophical. McDonald was betting that California's future wasn't just in cities. It was in towns like Santa Rosa that would grow into regional centers, that would anchor agricultural economies, that would provide the stability that boom and bust San Francisco couldn't offer. He was also making a social statement. In San Francisco, his mansion would compete with dozens of others, each trying to be grander than the last. In Santa Rosa, his mansion would be the standard, the reference point, the example others would aspire to match. He'd be a significant figure in a growing community, rather than just another wealthy man in an already crowded urban hierarchy. The construction proceeded methodically. Foundation laid, frame raised from massive redwood timbers, exterior walls constructed, roof installed. Crucial in California, where dry summers meant fire risk and wet winters meant occasional deluge. Then the detailed work began: interior walls, decorative elements, built-in cabinetry, all the finishing touches that transformed a structure into a home. By the time construction finished, likely around 1878 or 1879, Santa Rosa had a new landmark. Not just a house, but a statement about what California was becoming. The McDonald family moved into their completed mansion sometime around 1878, 1879, and with them came the beginning of Santa Rosa's Victorian Golden Age. Roderick McDonald, his wife, and their children weren't just occupying a house. They were establishing a standard, creating a template for what California success should look like. Roderick was a paradoxical figure in some ways, a man who'd made his fortune from the earth, but surrounded himself with Eastern refinement. He wore Victorian formality, but worked California agriculture. He spoke with immigrant Scottish practicality, but built with American optimism. He embodied the transformation California itself was undergoing, from rough frontier to established society. His wife managed the household with the precision Victorian domesticity required. This wasn't a simple task. A mansion of this scale needed staff, cooks, housekeepers, gardeners, perhaps a driver once carriages became elaborate. Managing these people, maintaining social obligations, raising children to understand their position without becoming entitled. This was full-time work that shaped the mansion's daily character. The children who grew up in McDonald Mansion were California's next generation, born into wealth that their grandparents couldn't have imagined, raised in elegance that seemed impossible a generation earlier. They attended the best schools Santa Rosa offered, then perhaps were sent east for finishing or college. They learned to navigate between California's still rough edges and the refinement their parents aspired to embody. The mansion quickly became a center of Santa Rosa's social life. Not in the sense of constant parties, Victorians were more restrained than that, but in the sense of being where important people gathered for important occasions. Dinner parties for visiting dignitaries, receptions for traveling lecturers or performers, meetings of civic leaders discussing Santa Rosa's future. The mansion's drawing room saw more consequential conversations than most government buildings. This was where power operated in Victorian California, not through official channels primarily, but through social networks. Who you knew, who you entertained, who entertained you. McDonald's mansion gave him access and influence that went far beyond whatever formal positions he might have held. The mansion was his office, his boardroom, his platform for shaping community decisions. Notable events, they wouldn't have made newspaper headlines necessarily. Victorian society operated more privately than ours, but every dinner party was an event in its way. Every reception was political. Every seemingly casual conversation in the library could determine business deals, marriages, civic projects. The mansion was where Santa Rosa's future was being quietly negotiated by people who understood that real power doesn't need to be loud. There would have been specific memorable moments, though records are frustratingly sparse. Perhaps a visit from California's governor, maybe a musical evening featuring a touring concert pianist, possibly a wedding that united two prominent Santa Rosa families. These events mattered not for their grandeur, but for their function. They were how society replicated itself, how values were transmitted, how the next generation learned their roles. The mansion served exclusively as a private residence in these early years. This was important. McDonald wasn't running a business from his home. He wasn't blurring boundaries between commercial and domestic. The mansion was sanctuary, symbol, and social center, but it remained fundamentally a family space. That distinction mattered in Victorian culture. Your home reflected your character, and keeping it separate from commerce was a mark of having truly arrived. But the mansion's influence extended beyond its walls. Other wealthy Santa Rosa residents saw what McDonald had built and aspired to similar grandeur. More Victorian mansions rose across the town, architectural standards elevated. Santa Rosa was becoming a proper Victorian city, with all that implied about social structure, cultural expectations, and physical environment. McDonald Mansion was both catalyst and template for this transformation. The family also used their wealth and position for civic purposes, not philanthropy in the modern organized sense, but the Victorian understanding that the wealthy had obligations to their community, supporting churches, funding schools, contributing to civic improvements. McDonald wasn't just wealthy, he was a leading citizen, which meant something specific in Victorian America about duty and responsibility. Victorian architecture was never subtle, and McDonald Mansion was thoroughly, unapologetically Victorian in its aesthetic. George Franklin Barber's designs favored what we'd now call Queen Anne style, asymmetrical facades, multiple roof lines, decorative elements that announced themselves proudly. This wasn't minimalism. This was architecture that wanted to be noticed, admired, discussed. The mansion likely contained between 12 and 20 rooms, depending on how you counted. Were servants' quarters separate rooms or service spaces? Was the library distinct from the study? Victorian floor plans were complex, with spaces designed for specific social functions that we no longer maintain. The entrance hall set the tone immediately. High ceilings at least 10 feet, possibly 12 or more in public spaces. This height wasn't just aesthetic. It was practical in California's climate, allowing hot air to rise and creating more comfortable living spaces in summer. But it was also psychological. High ceilings made visitors feel small and pressed, aware they were entering a space of significance. The staircase would have been the hall's centerpiece, not just functional movement between floors, but architectural sculpture. Victorian staircases were stages for social performance, coming down for dinner, greeting guests. The staircase was where you were seen, where your clothing and bearing could be properly displayed and admired. The drawing room or parlor was the mansion's social heart, where guests were received, where afternoon calls occurred, where the family presented themselves to the community. This room would have been furnished with the finest pieces McDonald could acquire, probably a mix of factory-made furniture from Eastern manufacturers and perhaps some custom pieces from California craftsmen trying to match Eastern quality. The colors would have been rich, deep, what Victorians considered sophisticated, deep reds. Forest greens, rich browns. These weren't spaces flooded with light. Heavy drapes controlled illumination, creating a controlled environment where lamplight would glow warmly on polished wood and fabric. Victorians weren't afraid of darkness. They used it deliberately to create atmosphere and intimacy. The dining room was crucial. Victorians took meals seriously, particularly dinner, which was the day's main social event. The room would need to accommodate formal dining for at least a dozen, possibly more. A massive table, matching chairs, a sideboard for serving, china cabinets displaying the family's best porcelain. This was where social hierarchy was reinforced through seating arrangements, where conversation was an art form, where knowing proper etiquette marked you as civilized. There would have been a library or study, essential for any Victorian man of importance. This was masculine space, deliberately distinct from the feminized drawing room. Dark wood paneling if possible. Bookcases filled with leather-bound volumes. A substantial desk. This was where business was discussed, where important documents were signed, where McDonald could retreat from domestic life into the serious world of commerce and civic affairs. The bedrooms were upstairs, away from public spaces. The master bedroom would have been substantial. Victorians didn't believe in minimalism anywhere, but especially not in private spaces. Heavy furniture, multiple wardrobes, perhaps a private sitting area. This was refuge and sanctuary, decorated to personal taste rather than social expectation. Guest bedrooms were essential. Victorian hospitality meant offering overnight accommodation to visitors from out of town. These rooms needed to be comfortable and well appointed, reflecting well on the family's generosity and prosperity. Servants' quarters were segregated, typically in the attic or in separate outbuildings. The mansion's operation required domestic help, but Victorian propriety demanded that help remain invisible except when actively serving. Servants had their own staircases, their own work areas, their own social hierarchy that paralleled and supported the family's life without intruding upon it. The kitchen was probably at the back of the house, separated from living areas. Victorians didn't want cooking smells or kitchen noise infiltrating genteel spaces. This was a working area, utilitarian rather than decorative, though still built to high standards. A large wood-burning stove, extensive workspace, pantries for storage, a root cellar for preservation before refrigeration. Architectural features that made McDonald Mansion stand out included the trademark Victorian elements, bay windows creating dimensional interest, a turret or tower providing visual drama and interior variety, multiple gables breaking up the roofline, decorative woodwork, sometimes called gingerbread, adorning eaves and porches. These weren't just decoration. They were proof of craftsmanship, evidence of resources, symbols of having arrived. The porch, likely wrapping at least partially around the house, was crucial California architecture. This was outdoor living space before air conditioning made indoor living comfortable year-round. The porch was where you caught breezes in summer, where you sat in the evening, where you observed the street and were observed in turn. It was liminal space between private and public, allowing social interaction while maintaining domestic boundary. Interior woodwork was probably Redwood, California's magnificent native timber. Wainscoting in halls, built in cabinetry in multiple rooms. Window and door frames elaborately molded. Victorians loved wood and used it lavishly when they could afford it. The grain patterns, the warm tones, the sense of permanence, all of this mattered aesthetically and symbolically. Light fixtures evolved with technology during the mansion's early years. Initially oil lamps, then gas lighting if Santa Rosa's infrastructure supported it, eventually electricity as that revolutionary technology became available. Each transition required adaptation, but the mansion was built to accommodate improvement, reflecting Victorian faith in progress. Wallpaper was essential. Victorians rarely left walls plain. Patterns were elaborate. Colors were rich. Different rooms had different schemes. The wallpaper wasn't just decoration. It was identity, marking each space's character and function. The dining room's wallpaper would differ from the drawing room's, which would differ from bedroom patterns. Each room was its own world. Floor coverings included hardwood floors in public spaces, polished to reflect light, and extensive carpeting, particularly in bedrooms and upper floors. Oriental rugs if the family could afford imports, or quality domestic reproductions if not. Victorians loved pattern and texture, layering them enthusiastically without any concern for what later generations would call visual clutter. More was more in Victorian design philosophy, and McDonald Mansion would have embraced this aesthetic fully. The fireplaces, and there would have been several, were both functional and decorative. Santa Rosa's climate didn't require the intensive heating that eastern winters demanded, but winter evenings could be chilly, and fires provided ambience as much as warmth. Each fireplace would have elaborate mantels, probably in carved wood, possibly with decorative tile surrounds. These were focal points for rooms where family gathered, where important objects were displayed. Windows were large by Victorian standards, particularly in public rooms. This was partly fashion. Victorian architecture favored light and air despite the heavy drapes that seemed to contradict this. But it was also practical California adaptation. The mansion needed to capture breezes in summer, needed to take advantage of natural light, needed to blur boundaries between interior elegance and exterior landscape beauty. The color palette throughout would have been what Victorians called tasteful, meaning rich, saturated tones rather than pastels. Burgundy navy, forest green, golden brown. These colors were considered sophisticated, mature, proper for people of substance. Lighter colors were for children's rooms or summer cottages, not for serious Victorian mansions. Decorative elements were everywhere, not sparse modernist spaces, but rooms filled with objects. Photographs in elaborate frames, decorative plates on walls or stands, vases, statuary, clocks, whatnots displaying collections of small treasures. Every surface was opportunity for display, for showing both wealth and taste. The mansion's layout reflected Victorian social codes rigidly. Public spaces flowed into each other, hall to parlor to dining room, creating circuit for entertaining while maintaining distinct character for each room. Private spaces were segregated vertically and spatially, keeping family bedrooms away from service areas, maintaining boundaries that reflected the era's social structure. The land surrounding McDonald Mansion was as carefully planned as the house itself, though with distinctly California character. Victorian garden design had been developed in England's damp, temperate climate. Adapting those principles to Santa Rosa's Mediterranean pattern Wet winters, bone-dry summers required both knowledge and resources. The immediate grounds probably covered 2 to 4 acres, enough for substantial gardens without the overwhelming scale of a true estate. This was gentleman's property, large enough to be impressive, manageable enough to be maintained with reasonable staff. The landscape would have combined Victorian formality near the house with more naturalistic planting at the property's edges. Close to the mansion, geometric beds with seasonal flowers, gravel paths defining circulation patterns, perhaps a formal rose garden. Roses were Victorian favorites and thrived in California's climate with proper care and irrigation. Lawns were status symbols in California. Keeping grass green through summer required constant watering, which meant either reliable well water or municipal supply. A well-maintained lawn announced that you had resources to spare, that you could afford the water, the labor, the time to maintain something purely ornamental. Trees were essential for multiple reasons: shade in California's summer heat, visual screening from neighbors, seasonal interest, fruit production if practical. The property might have included native California oaks predating the mansion. Keeping mature trees showed respect for the landscape and provided instant maturity to otherwise new grounds. Ornamental trees were likely planted deliberately, palms perhaps, though that was more Southern California fashion, deciduous shade trees for summer comfort, evergreens for year-round structure. The choices reflected both Victorian aesthetic preferences and California horticultural realities. The vegetable garden was probably substantial. Victorians valued self-sufficiency, and before modern grocery stores, even wealthy households grew significant amounts of their own produce. This would have been located behind the house, out of sight from public spaces but convenient to the kitchen. Tomatoes, squash, beans, herbs, all the staples of California agriculture on a domestic scale. Fruit trees were almost certainly present: apples, pears, perhaps apricots or plums. California's climate made fruit growing relatively easy, and fresh fruit was luxury before modern refrigeration and transportation. An orchard, even a small one, was both practical and prestigious. The carriage house or stable was essential outbuilding, transportation required housing, and horses needed care. This structure would have been substantial, possibly including living quarters for a groom or driver. It represented significant investment beyond the mansion itself, evidence of complete establishment rather than mere house ownership. Water management was crucial in California. Wells had to be maintained. Irrigation systems, probably simple by modern standards but sophisticated for the era, had to deliver water where needed. Cisterns might have collected winter rain for summer use. Managing water was managing wealth in agricultural California, even on a domestic scale. Fencing defined the property, making clear where McDonald's domain ended and public space began. This might have been decorative iron or practical wood, depending on location and purpose. The front fence made social statement. Side and rear fencing provided practical security and privacy. The front approach, the drive or path from street to entrance, was carefully designed theater. Trees or shrubs might have created corridor effect, framing the house, building anticipation. The path's curve or straightness, its material, its width, all of these communicated messages about formality, welcome, the family's relationship with the broader community. Garden ornaments were Victorian favorites: statuary, urns, benches, bird baths. These weren't natural landscape, but landscape as art gallery, outdoor space arranged for aesthetic pleasure and social display. A well-placed bench became destination for garden strolls. A statue provided focal point and conversation topic. The overall effect was cultivated naturalism. The grounds should look beautiful but not obviously labored over, expensive but not ostentatious, Californian but properly Victorian. This balance required significant horticultural knowledge and constant maintenance, particularly in Santa Rosa's climate where winter rain could produce jungle. Like growth that summer, drought would then kill without irrigation. McDonald Mansion's story across the decades is one of adaptation and survival, both literal and metaphorical. The first major test came in 1888, just a decade after completion, when a significant earthquake struck the region. The mansion survived, though likely with some damage. Victorian construction was actually reasonably earthquake-resistant. Wood frame structures could flex and move without catastrophic failure, unlike later unreinforced masonry buildings. But the real test came in 1906. The San Francisco earthquake and fire that destroyed much of California's greatest city also devastated Santa Rosa. Buildings collapsed. Fires raged. The death toll was substantial relative to the town's population, and McDonald Mansion survived, perhaps damaged, likely requiring repairs, but fundamentally intact when so much around it was destroyed. This survival wasn't pure luck. Victorian wood frame construction, that redwood strength, the quality of original workmanship, all of this mattered when the earth moved. But survival also meant the mansion became even more valuable, both practically and symbolically. It was proof that building well, building properly, building to last meant something real. Post-earthquake repairs were probably substantial but are poorly documented. Windows would have needed replacement. Plaster would have cracked. Chimneys, always vulnerable in earthquakes, might have required rebuilding. The work would have been done in the months and years following 1906, as Santa Rosa slowly rebuilt. But earthquakes weren't the only force requiring adaptation. Technology was transforming domestic life. If the mansion didn't have electricity in 1906, it certainly gained it soon after. Gas heating might have been added. Plumbing was continuously improving. Indoor bathrooms evolved from luxuries to necessities, from one or two to multiple facilities. Around the 1920s and 30s, Victorian style fell dramatically out of fashion. What had seemed elegant now seemed fussy. What had seemed sophisticated now seemed cluttered. Many Victorian mansions were demolished during this period or remodeled beyond recognition, their elaborate details stripped away in favor of cleaner, more modern aesthetics. McDonald Mansion's survival through this period suggests either owners who valued history over fashion, or perhaps economic circumstances that prevented expensive remodeling. Sometimes poverty preserves what prosperity would destroy. If you can't afford to modernize dramatically, you maintain what exists. The Great Depression years were probably challenging for maintaining a property of this scale. Staff became harder to afford. Maintenance was deferred. Gardens simplified. The mansion may have taken on a slightly shabby, genteel character during these years, still grand, but no longer quite as carefully maintained as originally. World War II brought different pressures. Materials were scarce. Labor was directed toward war industries. Large old houses became impractical when many women who might have been domestic servants were working in factories. Some Victorian mansions were divided into apartments during this period, their single-family grandeur sacrificed to housing shortage pragmatism. Whether McDonald Mansion was subdivided isn't clear from available records, but the economic and social pressures were universal. The war years were nobody's idea of Victorian elegance. It was survival mode, making do, adapting to circumstances far removed from 1877's optimistic mansion building. The 1950s and 60s brought another cultural shift. Suburban sprawl was transforming American housing patterns. New subdivisions offered modern convenience. Old Victorian mansions in town centers seemed increasingly anachronistic, too large, too expensive to maintain, located in downtowns that were being abandoned for suburbs. This is when many historic mansions were lost, demolished for parking lots, or commercial development, or simple neglect. The McDonald Mansion's survival through this period suggests it found adaptive reuse, sympathetic owners, or perhaps just flew under the radar of development pressure. By the 1970s and 80s, attitudes toward Victorian architecture were shifting again. Historic preservation was becoming a movement. People were recognizing that these old buildings represented irreplaceable craftsmanship and community character. Victorian detail that had been stripped away was now being painstakingly restored. Colors that had been painted over were being researched and recreated. If McDonald Mansion underwent restoration during this period, it would have been part of broader cultural reclamation of Victorian heritage. Original woodwork might have been revealed under layers of later paint. Wallpapers might have been reproduced from fragments. The goal wasn't to modernize, but to recover original character while adapting building systems to contemporary standards. Modern renovations, if they occurred, would have focused on making the mansion functional for contemporary use while preserving its historical integrity. This meant hidden compromises, modern electrical systems threaded through Victorian walls, HVAC systems carefully integrated without destroying architectural details, updated plumbing that maintained period fixtures while meeting current codes. The challenge with any Victorian renovation is balancing authenticity with livability. Original windows might be beautiful but energy inefficient. Period lighting might be atmospheric but inadequate. Historic kitchens were designed for servants and coal stoves, not modern appliances and open-plan living. Every renovation decision becomes negotiation between what was and what's practical. Seismic retrofitting would have been essential in earthquake-prone California. This means foundation bolting, shear wall reinforcement, sometimes invisible steel frameworks that hold Victorian elegance together during the next inevitable earthquake. The work is expensive, unglamorous, and absolutely necessary for a historic structure's survival. Paint colors were probably researched and restored at some point. Victorians used colors we'd find startling today, and decades of repainting had likely covered original schemes with more neutral, modern tones. Historic paint analysis can reveal what colors were originally used, allowing restoration that's historically accurate even if aesthetically challenging to contemporary eyes. Unlike some Victorian mansions with lurid histories, McDonald Mansion's darkness is more atmospheric than specific. There are no documented murders, no famous scandals, no sensational events that made headlines. But that doesn't mean the house is without shadows. The first darkness is structural to Victorian life itself, the rigid hierarchies, the invisible servants, the women confined to domestic spheres, the children seen but not heard. McDonald Mansion, like all Victorian homes, was built on assumptions about class, gender, and power that we now recognize as deeply problematic. The elegance existed because others labored in service areas, because women managed complex households without recognition, because social structures kept people in assigned places. Consider the servants who maintained the mansion. We don't know their names, don't know their stories. They're invisible in the historical record, except as line items in household accounts or occasional census entries. They lived in the attic or outbuildings, worked long hours for modest wages, had their entire lives structured around the McDonald family's comfort. That's not supernatural darkness. That's the ordinary exploitation that Victorian elegance required and concealed. There's also the darkness of earthquakes, 1906 particularly. Santa Rosa's earthquake killed over 100 people in a town of just 7,000. Buildings collapsed without warning. People died in their beds, crushed by falling walls and ceilings. The McDonald Mansion survived, but the family would have felt the terror, would have heard the screaming, would have watched their town burn and collapse around them. Did anyone die in the mansion during earthquakes? Records don't tell us, but they lived through catastrophe, and that leaves marks, psychological scars, survivors' guilt perhaps, the knowledge that their survival while neighbors died was chance, not virtue. The mansion stands partly on luck, and that's an uncomfortable truth. Victorian childhood in general had its own darkness. Infant and child mortality was shockingly high by modern standards. The McDonald family likely buried children. Most families did. Those deaths happened in the house, in bedrooms where mothers labored and babies died despite everything money could buy. Medicine couldn't save everyone, and wealth was no protection against scarlet fever, diphtheria, or any of the other childhood diseases that killed regularly. There's no evidence the mansion is haunted in the theatrical sense, no spectral figures, no unexplained phenomena documented by serious sources. But houses this old do carry weight. They've witnessed too much joy and sorrow, too many births and deaths, too many hopes fulfilled and dreams destroyed not to feel somehow saturated with human experience. Victorian culture itself had a darkness we often forget, the obsession with death and mourning, the elaborate funeral customs, the parlors where bodies were displayed before burial, the mourning clothes worn for years after loss. McDonald Mansion would have hosted wakes, would have displayed coffins, would have been a stage for Victorian death rituals we'd find morbid now, but were simply normal then. The broader darkness is California's own. The gold rush's environmental devastation, the displacement and genocide of native peoples, the labor exploitation in mines and fields that created the wealth that built mansions like McDonald's. The agricultural fortune that funded this house came from land that had been taken from indigenous inhabitants, worked by laborers who were often exploited, part of an economic system built on extraction and inequality. This isn't to single out the McDonald family as unusually villainous. They were typical of their time and class. But that typicality is itself revealing. The ordinary functioning of Victorian capitalism required and produced systematic injustice. The mansion is beautiful, but that beauty was purchased with human costs that remain invisible until we deliberately look for them. There are also the small, private tragedies that every house accumulates: marriages that failed but couldn't divorce in Victorian propriety, children who disappointed parental expectations, family members who drank too much or gambled too much or couldn't live up to the standards the mansion represented. These aren't spectacular scandals, but they're real suffering, and the mansion's walls held them silently. The Santa Rosa community itself has darker chapters: anti-Chinese violence in the late 1800s, labor strife in agricultural industries, the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. The McDonald Mansion doesn't appear directly in these stories, but it was part of the community where these things happened, and the family would have had opinions, would have taken positions, would have been implicated in the choices their community made. Tracing McDonald Mansion's ownership across 140 years reveals the story of Santa Rosa itself, from frontier town to agricultural center to modern California city. The McDonald family's tenure extended for several generations, though exact dates and succession are incompletely documented in readily available sources. Roderick McDonald's death. The exact year isn't clear from current research, but likely occurred in the early 20th century, would have transferred ownership to his heirs. Victorian inheritance patterns typically kept property within families across generations, with sons inheriting or widows maintaining residence, until their own deaths passed property to the next generation. The mansion likely remained in family hands through the 1906 earthquake and its aftermath through World War I, possibly into the 1920s or beyond. But eventually, as happened with most Victorian mansions, the property became too expensive for heirs to maintain. Property taxes rose. Maintenance costs increased. The economic model that made such houses viable eroded as domestic help became less available and more expensive. At some point, possibly during the Depression, possibly later, the mansion left McDonald family ownership. It might have been sold, might have been donated, might have passed through several owners in quick succession as different people tried and failed to make the economics of maintaining a Victorian mansion work in modern times. Some ownership periods might have seen the mansion subdivided into apartments or rooms, a common fate for Victorian houses after World War II. This wasn't always done carefully. Original rooms were partitioned. Inappropriate additions were made. Architectural details were destroyed or hidden. The mansion's integrity was compromised in service to practical housing needs. Other ownership periods might have been more sympathetic, people who recognized the mansion's historical value and tried to maintain its character, even while adapting it to contemporary use. These owners are often the unsung heroes of historic preservation, spending their own money to maintain buildings that benefit entire communities. At some point, likely in the late 20th century, as historic preservation movements gained strength, the mansion may have been designated a local historic landmark. This provides some legal protection against demolition or inappropriate alteration, though it doesn't solve the fundamental economics of maintaining old buildings. Current ownership status would require local research to confirm. The mansion might be privately owned by someone committed to preservation. It might have been converted to commercial use, offices, event venue, bed and breakfast. It might be owned by a preservation organization or historical society. Or in the worst case, it might have been demolished, though this seems unlikely given the structure's significance. If the mansion survives today, its owners face the ongoing challenge all historic property owners face: maintaining historical integrity while meeting modern safety codes, accessibility requirements, and economic realities. Every repair decision becomes a preservation question. Every upgrade must balance contemporary needs with historical authenticity. No famous figures or major political events appear directly linked to McDonald Mansion in available records. This isn't unusual. Most Victorian mansions housed locally prominent families whose significance was regional rather than national. The McDonald family mattered tremendously in Santa Rosa, but wouldn't appear in national history books. That doesn't make their story less important, just more intimate, more representative of how most Americans actually lived. The mansion's significance isn't in hosting famous people, but in being exemplary, a well-preserved or well-documented example of how California's agricultural wealth translated into Victorian elegance, how frontier towns became civilized communities, How American architectural styles adapted to California conditions. The McDonald Mansion's current status requires on-the-ground knowledge of Santa Rosa's historic properties. But we can discuss how Victorian mansions like this typically exist in modern contexts, and what McDonald Mansion's options might have been or currently be. If the mansion survives intact, it likely serves one of several possible functions. As private residency, some Victorian mansions remain single-family homes, owned by people with both resources and commitment to maintain them. This is increasingly rare. Few modern families want or can afford the space, upkeep, and property taxes such houses require. But it does happen, and when it works, it's ideal preservation. The building remains as designed, lived in, and loved. The bed and breakfast of Victorian mansions are natural B&Bs, multiple bedrooms, elegant common spaces, romantic historical atmosphere. Converting to this use requires adding bathrooms, updating safety systems, meeting hospitality codes. But it can make the economics work, allowing the property to generate income that funds maintenance while letting visitors experience historical ambience. Of event venues, weddings, receptions, corporate events, Victorian mansions make dramatic settings. This use typically requires even more modification than B&B operation, commercial kitchens, parking, accessibility compliance, maximum occupancy calculations. The building becomes backdrop for other people's celebrations, which can feel either like appropriate continued life or like exploitation of history for commercial profit, depending on perspective. Thus, museum or historical sites, some Victorian mansions become museums preserved as examples of period architecture and lifestyle. This requires organizational support, historical societies, preservation groups, or municipal backing. The economics are challenging. Museums rarely generate enough admission revenue to cover expenses, but they serve clear educational purposes and ensure permanent preservation. As professional offices, law firms, architects, medical practices, professional offices are common adaptive reuse for Victorian mansions. The conversion can be done respectfully, maintaining public spaces while adapting private rooms to office use. Parking is often challenging, and modern office needs require compromises with historical integrity. Subdivision, less ideal but economically practical. Some Victorian mansions are divided into apartments or condos. Done carefully, this can work. Each unit gets period charm while the building generates enough rental income to fund maintenance. Done carelessly, it destroys architectural integrity irreparably. For McDonald Mansion specifically, modern amenities would have been necessary regardless of use. Updated electrical systems meeting current code. Modern plumbing including